Heidi. Make you co-host in case you need it. And it's right about 10:15. So if you'd like to go ahead and get started, thank you for joining. And I'm really excited to hear more about what you had to say, especially after last night at the Gather.
Awesome. Thank you, Heidi. So let's see, it's about 10:16. How many people do we have with us today?
I see 58.
Oh, wow. Out of 200 and breakout sessions. That's really good.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. So I decided to do today a little bit differently. A lot of times I have PowerPoints and they're content heavy. So today I thought maybe I would just have some coffee and tell story because that's the way we think. Somebody, I'm looking at the chat, had to come here for more. Okay, well, some of it you'll hear a little bit of the history that we shared yesterday. So, okay, let me put my thinking cap on. Dleka klenach, mideduet, yuchat duasak, slinget klenach, seitzinak, yuchat duasak, nanyaich, nachatziti, kachari yari chatziti, shtakin kwan ayachat. Welcome. My English name is Mita DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Tsetzinak and Kat Klat. I have an adopted Inupiaq name that is Tegigaluk, and I have adopted Cree name, which is Boss Eagle Spirit Woman. And many of those who were part of the Alaska Plants as Food and Medicine were there when Harry Watchmaker gave me that name, and instantly it turned into Boss or Bossy. So hi, I'm seeing all the chats, everybody, all my lovely peoples, plant people. So as you know, Alaska is the center of the world, but maybe you didn't know that. But if you look at our location, we're strategically located in the best place to jump over the poles to go to Europe, to have commerce with Canada and Russia. We have the Pacific Ocean routes, and we have access to the Arctic nations as well. Well, before, when the sea ice was frozen, that seemed like an impossible passageway, but now with climate change, it's becoming a reality. Some people seem surprised at this, but our traditional stories actually have told us about the changes that are coming. Excuse me. And people are talking about snow, right? But we're in a La Nina year. So when we're in La Nina, it gives us a reprieve from the warming. But many of you have been watching the news, and October, the end of October, we still didn't have frozen Arctic sea ice, the seasonal ice. And it's the latest on record since records have been kept. And that's Western records though, right? So traditionally, our records are 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 years old. They're very old records, and they're kept in traditional oral storytelling. And so the way that traditional story is preserved is that there are people who are story keepers, and it's their job to tell stories and pass them down for the next generations. And people are taught from a very young age, and they're given these stories to then transition. Traditional storytelling is not only our historical records, but it's also a way to teach people and the foundation of our traditional education systems. And so these traditional education systems a lot of times are referred to as TEK, tech, right? And so I love the concept of tech and tech. So we have traditional ecological knowledge and then tech or technology. And that's what we're doing right here, right? We're using technology to transmit information and to share with each other in a traditional story time. It's of course not the same as being together face to face. However, it's what we have access to and a good way to keep each other safe in this time of COVID, which were also talked about. So when I talk about traditional ecological stories and stories from our elders, I'm referring to stories that have been gifted to me to hold and to help me understand what the times are that we're in and how do we transition well. And I have been uh, not asked, I've been told, basically ordered to share story with people to help us change the way that we think about things and move forward in a good way. And thankfully, science is catching up and the acceptance of reality is also here now. It took quite a few years to have climate change be an accepted concept, but now we've already hit over the 50% mark of people believing and understanding that climate change is real. And so once you hit that, that attrition rate, or not attrition, excuse me, the titration rate, then it becomes the overarching belief system um, through our communities. And in America, as you know, we're one of the most abundant countries in the world, one of the most powerful countries in the world. So, as Amerocentric as we can be, the belief systems that are here do actually matter because we have so much power in our military and policy and financially. So what we believe and how we behave does actually affect the rest of the world. And according to our traditional knowledge, in Alaska, the way that the energy flows or the jet streams flow is it comes up from Alaska and then down and across the country. And so as we shift our belief and our words here, it actually helps to shift the belief and the words of the rest of the Northern Turtle Island, right? Which is all Canada and America. And the northern people include Alaska Natives and First Nations in the Yukon territories or the Northwest territories as well, because that's the invisible border didn't exist beforehand. So you have to follow the way that the currents travel, which includes our First Nations neighbors. And so from communities in Southwest, which are known as Yupik, they have old stories that talk about Alaska being warm before, and it's going to be warm once again. And their stories talk about how we have to teach people the plants and medicine and how to live again. We also have stories actually from all groups that have come true. In Southeast, where I'm from, the Tlingit people, our medicine people, our Icht, saw that there was going to be a great power coming, a contention, and the possibility of our people actually being wiped out. And so they started implementing Christian symbology and concepts pre-contact, right, before colonization got there, to help transition the people in the way of our thinking, so that way we didn't go completely extinct and we could adapt in enough time. In Northwest Territories up by Great Bear Lake in Delaunay, they are waiting. They know from their traditional stories that there are going to be people, a great many people coming north to their communities where there hadn't been there before. And in their stories, their medicine person, so Great Bear Lake is like 1,200 square miles. It's like one of the larger lakes. 1,200 square miles is the Great Bear Lake. And he said if you had, boats, skiffs or canoes, right, the smaller boats, if you filled that whole lake side to side, front to back with boats, that's how many people are coming up there. And so that traditional knowledge, the words that we would use today would be climate refugees, people coming up because the lower parts of the earth aren't habitable any longer. And so there's lots of stories. One of the ones that I really appreciate is with Wilson. Justin talks about his elders. Actually, I appreciate all of them, but one of them that makes a lot of sense in the way that we talk and think is that the climate change started on contact, because that's actually when our relationship went out of balance. And we already knew that if you go out of balance with the environment, that what leads is famine and disease and death and having to migrate, right? And those were lessons learned because we actually have stories of being in this area at transitions of climate, the glacial maximums, glacial minimums, glaciers galloping. There's a few concepts that you have to change the way that you think about things. So we have the Bering Strait, and we had the Bering Land Bridge. And the land bridge was open 10,000 years ago and 12,000 years ago. However, most of our people's stories don't associate with coming over the land bridge. There is some of the stories from up north recognize the land bridge. They have relatives on the other side. They have full cognition of their migrations back and forth. And so some people did come from east to west, and some people went west from east. So one of the stories shared, and I don't know if she's on with me today, but Estelle Thompson talks about a DNA study that was done, that there's DNA in Central America from the Yupik people from Alaska, right? So it kind of flips this conversation on its head of where people come from. So to talk about my traditional migration stories is the story from my grandma and her grandmothers and the understandings that come with that. So my grandmother's Marion Paul DeWitt, her grandmothers are Tilly Paul and Susie Jones, and their understanding of the Teton is they came from the water, they came from the sea. And then if you start looking at those stories and connecting them with other stories of Indigenous people, you start to actually see the framework of how this happens. So we know that we're related to the people in Hawaii, the Indigenous people. We also know that we're related to the Maori. We have similar root words. We also have similar weaving. The Raven's tail weaving is similar in style and similar in the designs that we put on there. And so we recognize that that's our family. And so there were people who lived on the coast already when the people came from interior Canada area. So our language base, the Tlingit language base, is actually a Dene language base, and it fully became its own language just over 6,000 years ago. And we have stories with those people that they came up from Mesoamerica into the north, and then some of our relatives didn't like the cold, so they went back down south. Now, the picture that's painted on that side, from the Dene side, is that they came up from Mesoamerica, right? They didn't come over the land bridge. Well, what just came out? It came out just recently that the DNA from Central America area, some of it came from Australia, right? So some of the oldest people in the world came over the sea into Mesoamerica, and they did walk up north. The Dene people are some of the wandering people, and some of them stayed up here, and then some went back down. Well, the linguistic anthropology shows that the Navajo and the Apache are the Dene language base, and they're our relatives, they're our cousins, right? So after the receding of the last major glaciers, we had people who came from interior of North America to the coast. And there was already people living on the coast. So the people who were living on the coast came from the sea, and they were called the Raven people. And then we have the people who came from the interior, who were originally the wolf people and now are the eagle people. And we had very specific marriage arrangements that occurred so that the people could live in harmony and always live in reciprocity and balance with each other. And so we have this sacred union between the Pacific Islanders and the Dene people on the coast in Southeast for the Tlingit people. Now that occurred probably 14,000 years ago, that people came to the coast. The people living inside, they have shown up to 24,000 years that they've been there. And then the receding of the glaciers happened about the times of the Great Floods, because that's what occurred, was some of the Great Floods. And so we have these stories, and the reason they migrated to the coast was because of climate change. There were food systems broke down, famine, disease, death, injury, and actually coming to the coast, they didn't know if they were going to make it. They had to go under a glacier and in a river that flowed under the glacier to somewhere. They sent 2 scouts over the glacier, but most of the community couldn't make that travel. So the scouts said, yes, there's somewhere to be on the other side of the glacier. And then 2 old women, they volunteered to go under the glacier. And I can't go into the full story because of the permissions that have to be associated with it. One of the issues that we have is there are people who like to steal our stories and tell them without permissions. So we have to be careful the way that we give them out. So they did make it. The people made it to the coast. And when they made it to the coast, the other people who lived out there greeted them. And there was great sorrow because of the loss and the death that occurred, from the climate change and experience of having to migrate. And there was also the grief, right? A tremendous grief of having to leave the land that they knew and that they loved to somewhere different. And so when you start looking at these kinds of stories, you start to understand the mental, emotional, and spiritual process that we have to go through in this next transition. And some of the things that have come to reality, people don't want to accept. I'm even on working groups with national conservation groups, and there's scientists who believe that we're going to reverse climate change. But the truth of the matter is we're not going to reverse climate change. The best that we can do is mitigate how far over that mark we go. So our Earth is changing. It always changes, but it's changing more rapidly and it's harder to adapt. However, we have come to a point in our human development that we can use traditional ecological knowledge and technology to move forward into adapting to these coming times. So we can ignore it and pretend that we're going to get cold again, or we can embrace it and we can go under that glacier. And I remember when I realized this several years ago, and I said, oh, so Tlingit, like the only way through this is to prepare for a good death. And that sounds slightly, macabre, but the truth of the matter is we do have to prepare for a good death, because there's ways of being that we have grown accustomed to that we're going to have to give up. We're going to have to let go, right? And we have to return to a concept that is, who are we as human beings, right? Because we got too big for our britches. So coming back into what is a human being. So the point of being a human being is to be a good steward of the land and to take care of each other. Of all things, of all people, when they're searching around to figure out what the meaning of life is, that's it, is to be good to the land and good to each other. There's no higher calling, and to be into service to the land and to be into service to each other, that's also how you find creator and how you connect into the deeper meanings of self in the universe, because we are in this cosmic dance, of entropy, death, and life. And how do we augment life? And that's actually one of the soul driving concepts in Tlingit culture, is that balance and reciprocity and cultivating abundance, right? And helping to have more food that's available, but not just for human consumption, but also for the land as well. So at Contact, whether it was on East Coast, West Coast, Alaska, everywhere, the indigenous people, they tended the wild, right? They cultivated the wild spaces. And we had direct interactions on every level to help improve the abundance, whether it's burning, the berry patches in the winter, or burning the dead trees in the winter so we don't have massive forest fires, into our fog woman baskets where we put eggs of salmon and the sperm under, gentle flowing areas that had small waterfalls, and then it would bring back those fish. Those fish would actually hatch out of those baskets. And so when we start looking at what is the purpose of being a human being, right, to take care of each other and to tend the earth, and then we look at, as human beings, we like to create and we like to do and we like to build. And as creator beings, we've created technology in ways, that we can use automated intelligence, AI, to help us do our job better. And so our entire economy has to transition into how do we tend our spaces, and not just tend, we actually have to clean up the environmental damage. So as much as we want to say that we can glorify this experience of just living off the land, the reality is we have toxic sites all over the United States, and actually Alaska has some of the most Superfund sites and most military toxic sites out of the US. And so we actually have to go in, and instead of creating new toxic dumps like Pebble Mine and other places, we have to start cleaning up what we do have and transitioning it. Part of the reason why is because of sea level rise. And there was a document that came out under Val Davidson and Jay Butler under the Walker administration, that shows 86% of our communities on the coast will have to move due to sea level rise and increased storm surges. And so we have to prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally that we do have to make these transitions and support our communities in those transitions as well. And in that, we have to clean up those spaces, because the things that used to be stable are no longer stable. So we have holding ponds all over the US that, with the increased rain and precipitation that's coming, will be compromised. They already are, and they'll be more increasingly so. And so we're going to have to clean up our water as well. I'm going to look over here for some questions real quick.
Thanks, Maida. That's such a powerful presentation. And yeah, I just wanted to mention you have about 5 minutes, so I can help monitor the chat too if anybody would like to type or unmute themselves, they can.
Well, I was wondering, just to make sure, so some venues have a chat area and some venues have a Q&A area. So these are all in the same space, correct?
We just have the chat, and this is just a regular meeting, so.
Cool. Well, thank you. So when we're looking at our food systems, the important concepts that we have to work on are adaptation. We have our existing plants and animals, which are extremely resilient because, can you mute? Thank you, I'm getting some feedback, awesome. Because of our extreme transitions in the summer and winter. So our plants and animals are more adaptable than some that you would find like at the equator, where the transition of temperature is only minor. So what we have to look at, according to our elders like Dr. Rita Blumenstein, is we have to look at the regions just below us, the ecoregions, and then move those plants upwards. But intelligently, right? We are not going to take something that's invasive and move it up here. But what are the things that do well in the climates just below us, and start migrating them intentionally and building our food systems here? Not only that, but it is within our culture to grow food. The Tlingit people grew potatoes and other trade plants intentionally. We did farm. Not only do we cultivate natural spaces, but we did farm. It looks a little bit differently because the agrarian type of farming is heavily intensive, like daily activity, where traditionally we would do things like we would bring up potatoes from Central America, and they were planted on a south-facing hill. And you'd plant them in the spring and come back in the fall. you would just plant them in the best place that they could be so that they didn't require a lot of tending. We also used seaweeds and other fertilizers, fish, to grow things from the land. Okay, let's see here. Jen Landry says, are there examples of people cultivating indigenous plants for market in Alaska? Solid plants develop such markets. Yes, so there are a few people who wildcraft to take to market. And thank you for asking, Jen. I do have some examples of agrarian style cultivation of traditional plants. I worked with APU at the Spring Creek Farm with Steve Rubenstein and Rachel Miller. And we did demonstrate that the Alaska plants thrive and produce when they're tended, and you can tend them. And so it's a several-year demonstration project. One of the demonstrations is that we took plants from that space and we put in a traditional plant garden at the Heritage Center. And that was in relation with Dustin Newman and now Emily Tyrell. And they're actually going to start to curate plants for production and sale. And that's ongoing projects that we have longstanding partnerships with, and it's going to start happening. And it's important. Why? Because they do better up here. And when you tend them, they do actually produce more of the substance that you want, whether it's thicker roots or more leaves. They do really well in that kind of environment. And they're more stable for the long term. And then you don't have to worry about invasives getting out. All right, any other questions? We have like 3 minutes. Oh, look at all these great people on here. So the teachings of climate change at contact, that's Wilson Justin. He's an Athabascan elder. And I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being here today. And as we transition and close, just remember that we have about 5 years to make substantial transition and stability for us up here. And even though we have outward migration in the state, we're actually going to have an influx of inward migration to the northern areas as climate change intensifies. And we need to reclaim our farmlands and have more production in state. Oh, Naomi, hi. Look at Erin and oh my gosh, so many good people. I love plant people. They're the best people to work with.
Thank you so much, Meta. Hope to hear more from you during the conference and see you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you. Ganesh.
Ganesh Mita, thank you.
Yechayati.
Thank you, everyone. So we're going to keep moving right along. We don't have a lot of lag time in our conference. So I'd like to introduce Glenna Gannon, and she's going to be talking about adaptation in Norton Sound. And I work closely with Glenna, so I'm excited about her presentation. And it's right about 10:44, Glenna, so you can go ahead and get started here shortly.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. I am just sharing my screen here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you all can see that. So good morning, everyone. As Heidi mentioned, my name is Glenna Gannon. I am Assistant Professor of Sustainable Food Systems for the Institute of Agricultural, Natural Resources and Extension. And I'm from Fairbanks, Alaska, the traditional homelands of the Lower Tanana and the Dena'ina peoples. So born and raised here, and grateful to be joining you from here today, specifically from the Trothyed campus at UAF, so the traditional gathering place of the Tanana chiefs. So I think it's extra appropriate to acknowledge that I'm on a gathering place, joining you all here today as we gather. So first of all, I just want to say thank you, Gunalshish, Ameda. That was a really incredible and moving presentation, and I couldn't have asked for a better segue. And in some ways, I'm like, oh, you already said so much of what I was going to talk about. So there's some things that I won't get into the nitty gritty about, but just kind of acknowledge that Meda already gave us the long history of many of the aspects of mobility on the land in Alaska and really the world over. And so that's part of what I'll be talking to you about today. So specifically, this talk is about a project that I conducted as larger, just one piece of a larger National Science Foundation funded project that was called the Sustainable Futures North project. And it took this work that I'm going to talk about took place between 2016 and 2019. And really the purpose of it was to inspect the impacts of climate change on Western Alaska fishing communities and livelihoods. And I will say that this work was conducted with permission and in support of the tribal councils and communities in which it took place. Okay, so again, Meda really set us up beautifully, or set me up beautifully to talk about this project. The long history that our climate has changed over the years, but now in the current climate crisis, it's changing much more rapidly than it has in the past. And this is having profound and dramatic impacts on northern communities. And I do say northern because I mean all over the north, as you can see in that map of warming trends. The high Arctic is really subject to this warming, and it's going to have many cascading effects, some of which we're already seeing in Alaska with coastal erosion due to lack of sea ice and increasing winter storms. We have people who are noticing many shifts in species abundance and their dispersion across traditional territories. So, a lot of quick and onset changes, and in coastal Alaska, really we're seeing this now. It's not something that's happening down the road. Communities are up against it. So this was the impetus for this research. So I won't go into too much detail here, but we'll just talk a little bit about how important fishing is for coastal communities, especially Indigenous communities who have a multi-millennia long tradition of relationship with fish and the land. So not just fish, but the entire ecosystem, and fish and fishing being one of the things that sustained people over the many thousands of years. So these activities are really crucial to cultural well-being, economic well-being in a modern cash economy, and really central to cultural, social well-being. So after European contact and the introduction of the cash economy, rural locations in particular, especially where there are fewer ways to make a living via the cash economy, fisheries became a paramount part of Indigenous individuals' ability to stay in their community, earn a living, and to participate in the cash economy that we now have. And many people will talk about the dual economy, so the cash subsistence economy. And I won't go into too many details about that, but really the traditional economy is one of care and relationship and reciprocity. And that's what sustained people for many thousands of years. So there's many problems with a cash economy that I'll discuss a little bit later, but just talking about this history to set context for people who might not be familiar. I'm sure many of you are. So presently, with the rapid changes to the environment, including fisheries, disruptions, including collapses throughout the state. We've seen a lot of fisheries declining, specifically Chinook salmon along the Yukon River and all along the western Alaska coast. This is really causing fisherfolk a lot of grief and forcing them to quickly have to adapt to these changes in the landscape and the marine ecosystem, where the timing and location of fish and species is changing rapidly and affecting people's ability to make a living, both for their nutritional needs, cultural well-being, and economic needs. So just a little bit more about this study. It was a phenomenological study, which really just means looking at how people experienced a certain event. So that event being, you know, in the wake of the early 2000s Chinook salmon fishery collapse in Norton Sound, there's evidence of some demographic change. So people leaving the communities in this area potentially as a result of this fisheries collapse. There was really no data or information to support that's what's happened. But as part of that National Science Foundation grant that I mentioned earlier, the Sustainable Futures North, we were curious to know how environmental change is impacting you know, livelihoods all over the circumpolar north. So this was one opportunity to investigate that firsthand and get a perspective from Indigenous resource users to see. So to again tie in with the beautiful segue Mita gave me about human mobility, you know, human mobility has been something that our species has used for many thousands of years. We got a beautiful long history lesson about that a few minutes ago. But what we're seeing now, and you know, of interest for researchers and for the communities that are impacted thusly, is the dramatic and rapid shift in human mobility. So people being forced out of their communities. There's a term that Robin Brownen, an Alaskan a human rights activist and lawyer, has coined, called climigration, and that's really the highly disruptive pattern of people being forced into mobility due to severe and negative impacts from climate change. So we were curious to know whether or not this is what's starting or is taking place in Alaska. And so that was the impetus for this study.
Glenna, can I just interrupt you for a second? I hear some background noise, and if you're on your phone, be sure to mute your phone. So, thanks.
Thank you.
And Glenna, sorry, I just muted everyone just to double check. So go ahead and click your unmute button.
Oh, okay, great, there. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with Norton Sound, it's located off the Bering Strait of Alaska. You can see there the red box in the map. And the communities that I worked most closely with were Unalakleet, Shaktoolik, and to a lesser degree, Gullivan and Elam. So these are predominantly Inupiat and Yupik communities. Unalakleet was the traditional meeting point of, and the Unalakleet River was a major trading point from the interior northern and southwestern Alaska. So you have a mingling in Unalakleet of predominantly three cultural groups: the Inupiat from the north, Athabaskan from the interior, and Yupik from the south. So this is a historical place of meeting and trade, you know, and resiliency because of all of the different groups and resources that came together there. But anyway, the groups that I worked with in those communities were predominantly, again, the Unalakleet Tribal Council and Unalakleet fisherfolk. So, and I'll just reiterate, the purpose of the study was to better understand how people responded to fisheries closure and collapse in places where the majority of the population relies on fishing for their cultural and economic well-being. So I'll just go back a slide. And when I say the majority of the population, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone there is a fisher person, but what it does mean is that fishing is a huge part of the cultural fabric. So these communities, as you can see, are all along the coast. Most of them are on major rivers. You can see the Unalakleet River there, but you can't see in this map the Shaktoolik River, and that Gullivan is located strategically on a bay that leads into the Seward Peninsula above it. So these have been historic salmon fishing areas and places to collect, harvest marine resources. And that's part of the reason this was so interesting, to see people potentially moving away from where there's such a long historical connection to harvesting of marine resources. So the objectives, going back to the purpose of this study, the objectives were working with the tribal councils and the Norton Sound Economic Development Corporation and fisherfolk in these communities to identify a range of adaptive strategies that were employed by households and at a scale up the community following fishery collapse. So this, was trying to get a baseline of who stayed and who left and why. And it was to determine the short and long-term cumulative impacts of fisheries collapse in these communities, and those impacts in light of other fisheries, other issues such as fishery statuses like closures from regulatory agencies like Alaska Department of Fish and Game, really high food and fuel costs that many of you are probably aware of are a real issue for rural Alaska. And then also increased environmental risks like those I discussed earlier. So what I found by asking these questions was that mobility and adaptive strategies to environmental change proved to have implications well outside of just fishing and resource use. And that's what I'll spend the rest of this time talking to you about today. So for those of you who might be interested in how the study was conducted, like I said, it took place between 2016 and wrapped up in 2019. Over that time, there was secondary data analysis. So that was looking at Alaska fishing permits, how fishing permits have been transferred and changed over time, especially after disruptions to fisheries and closures. US Census data, and then the on-the-ground time that I spent in the communities involved doing structured interviews with key informants. So those were people who had been fishing in these communities for more than 10 years. And most of the time that was with elders who had been fishing for more than 20 or 30 years. There was also a good number of household surveys collected. And this systematic collection of household surveys was done by 2 locally hired research technicians who were hired to support the project and interact with their own community and try to assist relaying information that didn't have to go through the interpretation of scientists or in this case myself, but the research group, to try and collect information and then help interpret that. So this resulted in a more community-wide perspective on the impacts of fishing and climate change. And then I myself spent a total of non-consecutive total of 6 months out predominantly in Shaktoolik and Unalakleet first and then Shaktoolik. Okay, so just to talk about what came out of these interviews and this research, and I think the best way to do this is to use people's own words. So the most intriguing findings from the study really just didn't support that initial hypothesis that we had, that people, specifically fisher folk, left their communities after fisheries disruption. And instead it was clear that fishermen and women tend to be highly attached to their communities. There's a long history of cultural connection to these places, and that didn't come as a surprise, but it was surprising based on our initial hypothesis that it looked like people were leaving. So that didn't appear to be the case. Instead, people were really attached to their homes, their homelands. They're committed to staying in their communities, to being a part of their community, despite changes to the fisheries and the hardships that they experienced in light of changes to the fisheries and the disruptions. so I'll read these maybe for some who aren't the phone. So this was exemplified in one fisherman from Unalakleet saying, "I really don't believe people left because of fishing. People move for different reasons, jobs, employment being major ones. But we commercial fishermen, we don't leave too much, and I'm not going to leave for anything." And another fisherman, Elder Steve Ivanoff, who's an activist in his own right, in Unalakleet, and has been traveling around the country and the world to share with the world the rapid changes and the experiences of Indigenous people in Alaska due to climate change. And so he said, for many fishermen, of which he is, it's like what I tell my children, that they're not to rely on fishing for a living, and they can use it to subsidize a living. But for most people, they have jobs, and fishing is really a subsidy of their lifestyle here in Unalakleet. And there are other villages in the area that don't have the luxury of good jobs and fishing as their main income. So keep this quote in mind, because I'll kind of come back to it and talk a little bit about what this really forecasted for what we found in this study. And what I mean by that is there were unanticipated findings, and they're of particular interest, and they have an unexpected connection to fishing and policy and management and resource use. So to get into that a little bit, again, using the words of elder and longtime fisherman Junie Tawarik, he says, "Fishing is my retirement income, and plus my wife and I are trying to build a house up on the hill, so I have to go fishing. I have no choice on that, but it helps. Every little thing helps in reaching our goal. Building a home, we're trying to get away from the floodplain, trying to move up the hill." And so just to give you a little visual on what Junie is talking about. So on the lower left, you can see a picture of the slough behind Unalakleet. So that's the village of Unalakleet kind of from the backside. The ocean is just on the other side of those buildings. And this area is prone to flooding. There's not as much sea ice to buffer the coast from storms and wave action when it comes in. So waves can overtake the community. The waves also inundate the slough, and the wetland areas are all surrounding the community. And so these are major challenges, and it's a threat. And there's much of these communities, and Unalakleet specifically, that have flooded many times in what were previously considered 100-year floods. And it's happened, I think, 6 times in Unalakleet since the early 2000s. So what Junie's talking about here is using fishing. So that's a set netter off of the Unalakleet shoreline there, who's, he's a salmon set netter. And he's talking about using this income to move out of that flood zone and into the hills that you can see there in the background on the lower right-hand photo. So I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of this, because it's a pretty inspiring and also very informative situation. So common strategies that individuals reported using to adapt to these environmental disruptions involve substitutions and flexibility. So for example, with the declining fisheries or Chinook salmon fishery, people talked about substituting Chinook for coho, for silvers, and then also targeting other species. So, here we have one Unalakleet fisherman who said he's trying to fish all the fisheries available: herring, salmon, crab, all in the same year. We try to survive however we can. And so what I learned through the long histories that were shared with me by many elders was this isn't a new strategy. Indigenous people are ingenious and resourceful and flexible, and this is how they've really thrived on the land for many millennia, by using these strategies to always be adaptable. So I say here that being flexible is built-in resiliency, and that's what we're seeing going on currently in Unalakleet. This this data really supports to the, it's collecting that TEK, that tech with tech that Mita talked about. We're using tech to really lift up the voices of traditional knowledge holders and share those stories with a wider audience, which is what I'm grateful to be doing here with you today. So these strategies were repeatedly reported by many fishermen, and a majority of interview participants commented that they've been doing this for a long time. Their ancestors have been doing this a long time. People who previously targeted the multi-billion-dollar herring fishery transitioned to salmon after the 1980s and 1990s market crash for herring. So when Asia no longer was eating as much herring, the market for that fishery collapsed. It wasn't the population collapse. So there's different things over time that have caused disruptions for resource users and specifically fisher people in this area. And they've always adapted. They've always been flexible. They've always found an alternative. And so what we're seeing here is just another version of that, with people moving up into the hills and using their fishing income to do so. And so the significance of this, like what does it tell the broader audience? What did community members want to share? And so one of the things that is important to note is that we can expect, based on recent demographic trends, we can expect that communities will continue to grow in rural Alaska. And that is both by birth rates. You can kind of see in this chart here of Unalakleet is even after the dip in the 2000s, the population recovered. And if you look at demographic graphs from nearly all threatened communities in rural Alaska, and I'll get into a little bit more what I mean by threatened communities in a few minutes, but all of those population trends are going up. So communities are growing through birth rates, and they're also going to likely be growing in the future, as Mita indicated. There are many people in lower lying areas that are flood prone and areas that are drought prone that are going to be looking to new areas. And a lot of the literature in population dynamics and demographic studies indicates this and shows that it's already happening in other parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, where droughts are already wreaking havoc on people's ability to grow food and live their lifestyles healthfully. The other thing is that as a supplemental form of income, and this is probably, to me, the most exciting finding and what I wanted to share here today as part of the Alaska Food Policy Council, fishing is a form of adaptive capacity. It's a form of transferable adaptable capacity. And what I mean by that is it enhances individuals' ability to prepare for and adjust to the onset of environmental stress and to lessen the negative impacts that they're likely to experience or are experiencing by taking advantage of the existing resources and opportunities that are there. So in this case, it's healthy fisheries. Even though we've seen decline in many fisheries, there are, and I'll get into this a little bit more, programs in place that allow people to make a living fishing in Norton Sound in ways that aren't supported elsewhere. And this is really allowing people to adapt in place. So the other thing to note as significant from the few years that I was working on this project was that there's major regional differences. Even if you think back to that map of Norton Sound and the communities I worked in, Shaktoolik is not far up the coast. It's just 70 miles. And, they don't necessarily have Unalakleet's ideal scenario. So as you can see, this is a picture of Unalakleet in the lower part of the slide. And you can see just how exposed the community is to the coastal waters and to the river and the slough that run behind the community. But there's also hills right there in the background. And Unalakleet is fortunate enough, which there's a mixed history here, but they're taking advantage of a road that was put in by a military installment that was put into place during the Cold War that goes up into the hills. That was a radio tower access point. And so people now, the native village of Unalakleet Tribal Council and the city of Unalakleet and Cowarak have all teamed together to, rehab this road to make it more sound, and then also to start subdividing land out in the hills and making sure that people who have native allotments out in that area are able to access them so that they could get themselves out of harm's way.
Lena, I just wanted to interrupt and say you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll move this through quickly. I'm sharing a lot of story here. Okay, so what makes this possible? And this is really what I wanted to get into here, is the role of policy. So when I mentioned that Unalakleet and the Norton Sound area has some really specific policies that support fisher folks' ability to make a living, it's through the Community Development Quota Program. And so this was legislation that was passed in the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Management Act. And what it did is it created an allotment from all of the income from the Bering Straits, Aleutian Islands fishery. So that's where you see many of those national and international trawlers and fisheries. And it took a portion, 10% of those funds, and redistributed that money into local organizations, and in this case, the Norton Sound Economic Development Corporation, to reinvest that money from those profits back into the communities. And this is through a number of different lending and funding, education, and capital development programs. So there's policy here that supports people, and also the CDQ program is a residence-only policy. So it consists of a positive, many locals consider this a positive attribute, because that means for Norton Sound, only residents of Norton Sound communities can fish those waters, meaning that they're not subject to competition with really large boats and outside fishers. Any of you who know about fisheries in Alaska likely know that many of the boats that come up and fish in Bristol Bay and our Alaskan waters are largely from the lower 48 on the West Coast, so Oregon and Washington. And so this really creates an economy for local fisher folks, and that's exactly what it was intended to do. Generally speaking, this was an economic stimulus policy that has really benefited these communities. And so I'm going to kind of whip through it because I spent too much time talking. But the broader implications of what this kind of policy, even though it wasn't necessarily created to have these specific outcomes, what we're seeing is that there are positive outcomes by having good policy, by having policy that supports locals. So the broader implications of this is that for all of the 200 or so Alaskan communities that are affected to some degree by flooding and erosion, and the 31 who are considered in imminent existential danger from coastal erosion, flooding, and consequences of climate change, there's a path forward to adaptation, and it involves traditional harvesting practices and connection to culture. And it's definitely not the most just way for people to be adapting to climate change. And what I mean by that is getting into the history of colonialism and the people who are most affected by the negative outcomes of climate change not being the ones who started it through resource extraction, but they're victims to the negative consequences. And so you can see here the community of Shaktoolik, an aerial view on the left, and the community of Kivalina on the right. And you can just see how threatened these communities are. But what I found in talking to folks, even in Shaktoolik, they have strategies in mind for how they can move their community and adapt their community. And really, the biggest thing that people said, and I'm paraphrasing here, was that if given investment from state and federal funding agencies, if given support by agencies like the Denali Commission to support critical infrastructure projects like evacuation routes, then these projects can really empower communities to adapt in their own way, and in a way that keeps them connected to the land, connected to each other, connected to culture. And this will have fewer maladaptive consequences along the way for one-time solutions, so to speak, like seawalls that are likely to only have a 10 to 20-year lifespan before they need to be addressed again. And so I know I'm running out of time and I got kind of quick there, but I'll leave it at that, and I'll say, Koyana, thank you so much. And maybe we have time for a question or two.
Thanks, Glenna. We do not have any time for questions, but Huva has a pretty good feature where you can actually contact speakers, anybody attending the conference. So do check that out and contact Glenna in Huva or by email. Thank you so much for your presentation, Glenna. It is 11:15, so we're going to move right along to our next presentation, also related to traditional food, traditional knowledge. And so we're going to have Alex Whitting, Chris Dankmeyer, Cyrus Harris present about seal oil production and pasteurization for the Manilic long-term care facility. So Alex, I see you are on, and good morning.
Hello? Can you hear
Hi,
me?
we can hear you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Alex Whiting with Native Village Ecological, and I'm going to present about our Manilic Seal Oil project with Cyrus Harris from Manilic and Chris Dankmeyer from Manilic. Manilic Seal Oil project is a quest to serve safe seal oil to elders at the Utukanat, our long-term care center at Manilic Health Center. Seal oil is the rendered oil from seal blubber. There's some jars of it there that has been a staple for Inupiaq people since time immemorial. It provides valuable calories for dealing with the Arctic environment and is part of the identity of the Inupiaq people. From babies to elders, it is eaten regularly throughout the year. It provides a sense of well-being, especially to the elders that are living in Manilic Association's long-term care facility and do not have regular access to it. Currently, it's only available to them during monthly potlucks. I'm going to let Cyrus Harris talk about the hunting and making of seal oil traditionally.
Good morning. My name is Cyrus Harris, and I work for Manilic Association for the Hunter Support Program and also Natural Resources Advocacy. The purpose of this seal oil task force and what we're working to get to is to make safe seal oil for our elders at the long-term care. Seal oil being one of the most important food sources that we've consumed for time immemorial. It's a main staple diet that we harvest and store to put away and use it in many ways throughout the winter. So with this presentation, we do our adult bearded seal hunt during the months of May and June after the Ladfast ice breaks up in front of the Kotzebue Sound. And we're out on a boat with out in the ice pack riding, and then we spot seals. We make a selection, or ugruk rather, make a selection of which ones we can use. And then the next slide. After we harvest the ugruk, we immediately dress the ugruk or gut the ugruk and save some delicacy parts in there, such as the heart and kidney and the intestines. And next slide, Alex.
Now it's up there.
Next slide. After immediately gutting, we cool it off in the ice cold frigid waters out in the Kotzebue Sound. Nice good salty water, to add along with cooling off the whole carcass and cleaning off that excess blood. So we even if we got it then, there's a good chance it's 12 hours later before we head up to the beach to harvest. It could be longer. So we immediately cool off the carcass, get all as much blood as you can soaked up, and And then we pull the carcass back up on the ice to drain further. And once that's done, once that's done, we put back, we make a room in the boat, to lay the carcass out in the boat and cover with a canvas tarp. A white canvas tarp helps reflects the heat of the sun, and it also keeps the carcass cool throughout continuing our hunt there, because we're looking for 4 ugruk to fill up the boat, and each ugruk is roughly about 300 pounds, and that would be a good decent catch. So next slide, we travel back up, we head back home, and we got our own certain work areas. This photo here is just right in front of my inisuks, or my meat racks, traditional meat racks. And so I got my son and my wife there separating the carcass from the skin and blubber. And so we do that in a clean manner as we possibly could, just to reduce the amount of work we got to do later. And so after that's done, on the next slide, we laid out our skins and blubber, at least overnight, just to help any pH or moisture in the skin and blubber for it to evaporate, and also for that very top layer to kind of like dry, little crisp, just enough to get any excess meat or blood portions off. And on the slide on the right side corner, it's to my right side, is my wife there. She's fleshing the blubber from the skin, and with what we call a fleshing board. This is a new style fleshing board that we use today. Back in the day, we would use maybe a sheet of plywood, roughly about 2 feet by a foot, and be working on the ground, not on the ground, but on where the skin and blubbers were laying. But this method makes it much easier by having the weight of the blubber itself kind of fold down as you flesh off the skin. And then so once that's completed, the big blubber, next slide, the big blubber pieces are set on a separate table and then cut down to smaller pieces, roughly about a 1-inch by 3-inch piece. And I've always liked to cut in between those like a donut shape or a round shape, just to help speed up the rendering process. And so after all that's done, we set into containers. What I use today is 30-gallon containers. And this, just by looking at the photo, it looks like it's about 4, maybe 5 days in the container itself, just by looking at the amount of oil that it's got. The first 3 days at least, there's not going to be very much of oil, but we keep these containers in a safe contained spot where it's not too warm yet, not too cold. The cooling, once the weather cool off, it slows the process down for it to be rendering, but with ideal weather conditions, we have good rendering process. I kind of went a little bit ahead of myself, but then after we cut the carcasses off, there's 2 sections of large amount of meat, boneless meat. We have the front straps and the back straps that we hang on our meat racks, and we hang them there more or less to get the gamey taste off, or gamey, just like how you would hang beef or caribou or moose. But we do it in that manner on our meat racks for at least 3-4 days. And then during the time that's hanging, we're also taking care of the blubber and stirring it at least twice a day. And okay, So once that's completed, give or take 7-10 days, sometimes with the weather, challenging weather, maybe 12 days when the blubber containers are rendered down to the oil. During that time, we're watching, we're taking care of the blubber to render. We're also working on the front straps and the back straps. The back straps, we make what we call blankets, or they're thin, great big blanket piece of dried meat, and the front straps are made into long strips. And with those long strips are the portions that we do cook. And so once those dry out for a period of time and the oil is ready to store, or once it's rendered, we cut the meat pieces into serving size pieces and use layers of the blubber itself and the meat and oil into our containers that we're going to be storing it in. So I leave those with a loose lid for at least 3 or 4 days, sometimes a week, just enough time for the oil to soak into the meat. And the only time I contain the lids on my containers is when I'm transporting from camp to the freezers. And so once they're set in the freezer, they have a much longer shelf life than what we would have back in the day when we didn't have refrigeration. So that's our main staple of diet, seal oil and the stored meat in there, and throughout the whole coastal communities of the indigenous country. And this is just a method that we use, and the importance of having and eating seal oil is it has been in our diet for time immemorial. And the big concern that I had early on was that this just so happened to be a restricted diet for our elders at the long-term care. Although we're able to serve it through our potlucks, monthly potlucks, or I could take a little dish to an elder, but yet on their daily, they're missing out on it on their daily meal. So that's the practice of the hunting and preparing method of making seal oil. And I'll either have Alex or Chris explain the Siglo model. Chris, Alex, you're on.
Okay, thanks, Iris. So the state of Alaska had long had provisions for the donation of wild game meat and other traditional foods to institutions, but the federal laws are a little bit more restrictive, and we are running into issues with that, like we talked about with, especially with seals and seal oil. And Utukanak Inat, the long-term care was opened in 2011. And it was clear, since elders were living there 24/7, 365, it was clear that we needed to figure out a way to provide them with seal and seal oil, especially. A lot of our congressional leadership and others in the state lobbied in the 2014 Farm Bill for having a traditional foods amendment that would allow for more flexibility, more access in the federal code, just like the state of Alaska had. And after that, the 2014 Farm Bill was passed. Manila opened up the Siglock, which is a place for processing foods, and that's what Cyrus runs the Siglock. He gets fish and game and processes it there. It's a federally regulated processing center. It's all up to snuff and very sanitary, and protocols for all the processing of the foods. In June 2015, a group was assembled to advocate for and discuss how to deal with serving seal and seal products in hospital settings. And not only the long-term care, but places like ANMC and Anchorage and other places around the state where it was a issue where the elders wanted access to seal and seal oil, but there was challenges with that particular item. And a seal oil task force was assembled during the first call, and ANMC and NMS and Manilic and ANTHC and UAA and DHSS, Kodiak Marine Science Center, ADEC, DH, and Native Village of Kotzebue were all working and discussing about that issue of dealing with seal and seal oil, or seal products, I guess, at that point. The Manilic Seal Oil project, after about a year or so of discussions, it was obvious that while there was some hurdles with seal and seal products, the biggest hurdle was with seal oil. In particular, that's because traditionally processed seal oil didn't have a critical control point. There was no heat applied, no pasteurization, and so it was there was no way to assure safety. And neither the state or the feds would allow for regular serving of seal oil because of the risk of CBOT, Clostridium botulinum, that produces botulism. The CBOT is the biggest risk with seal oil. And so the Manilic Seal Oil project focused specifically on how to go about creating seal oil. Especially at first, we were just trying to stick with traditional seal oil, but figuring out if there was a way without heating it that we could make it safe. And a lot of the same participants in the seal oil task force are part of the seal oil project, especially Manilic Native Village of Kotzebue, the Kodiak Seafood and Marine Science Center, and we brought in the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of Bacteriology. They're one of the only places, if not the only place, I think, in the country that can work with botulism because it's such a deadly toxin. But they were set up to already deal with that, so we brought them on board. And then we studied seal oil and CBOT, and especially focusing on the pH, because the pH is a critical control point in the sense that CBOT can only thrive and reproduce in pH is, above 4.5, 4.6. So we had to understand what the pH levels were for traditional seal oil throughout the entire process, including the blubber and the different stages of seal oil rendering. And what we found was the blubber was generally in the 6.5 to 7 range, which is really good for growing CBOT. But while the blubber still remained usually above 6 by the time it was done, the seal oil itself was in the 4.5 pH range by the time it was finishing rendering. So we did learn about how the level of the seal oil over time decreases. Our most likely thought about that is that there's a small amount of lactic acid in the blubber. And when we render the seal oil out of the blubber, while the blubber still remains high in pH, above 6, the oil itself, with a small amount of lactic acid added to it, can drop all the way down below 5 or in the 4.5 range. Although there still needs to be further study on that. That's just kind of our leading hypothesis right now of what's happening there. So in order to create a HACCP with traditional seal oil without cooking it, we looked at adding lactic acid or citric acid to the blubber before it was rendered. I mean, right at the time that you put it in the buckets to reduce the pH to around 4 or 4.5 or even 3.5, real low. So we knew that there's no way that CBOT could grow in it. And it was found that with a very small amount, the 0.05% was found by volume, I guess, was found to reduce the blubber and the seal oil to that low of a pH. And you could see the little chart there of the different controls and batches that we did with lactic acid and citric acid. So after University of Wisconsin did the research, uh, we decided to make sea oil both as traditionally as a control, and then with adding the 0.05% of lactic acid to the blubber strips. And so we had the two different buckets of blubber you could see there in the picture. And they were clear buckets so we could watch the entire process. And we did them both exactly the same, except for we added the lactic acid to one and just kept the other one traditional. And at the end of the experiment, we found that the blubber that we added the lactic acid to was a gray color, and it didn't really render very good at all. And it was kind of funky smelling, and nobody was brave enough to taste it, even though there was like almost zero risk of sea bot. But the traditional oil had rendered just normally. So we knew that adding acid was going to just be too problematic, especially if we couldn't even get anyone to try the test batch. There's no way we could be confident of, even if it did render, of feeding it to the elders. So then what we thought is, well, what if we make traditional sea oil and then we pasteurize it, we heat it up? Would that, at least destroy the toxins that were produced during the rendering process, if any? And the University of Wisconsin did some more testing for us using traditional made sea oil and heating it and injecting it with botulism. So they knew there was botulism in it. They knew there was toxins in it. And then heating it to different temperatures for different time lengths. And they found that that's supposed to be 185 degrees for 10 minutes or even 5 minutes, I guess. It totally destroyed all the toxins that were in the soil. So then since we knew that we could heat it for a certain amount of time at a certain temperature at the 185, that we thought we would have a taste test to make sure that it didn't change the flavor of it after doing that. So we used a wok and we heated up two different batches, one at 176 degrees for 2 minutes and one at 100, that's supposed to be 185 degrees for 10 minutes. And then we had a sample with no heat control, and we had a blind taste test with sea oil eaters here, and they all tried it, and both the two different heated sea oils were picked and for taste, and nobody actually picked the traditional non-heated sea oil. So that was interesting, but it also was the green light for us to move forward with a pasteurization process for the traditionally processed sea oil. So we can still make the sea oil like we always did, not using heat to render it out, but then to destroy whatever toxins may be present by using the 185 for 10 minutes. And we used 10 minutes, even though 5 minutes was shown to be effective, just to give an extra edge of safety. So I guess this these slides here and this little discussion kind of just goes over what I just talked about there. That's the University of Wisconsin experiments that showed the destruction of toxins for a certain times and a certain temperatures. And so after we did the taste test, after Wisconsin did the experimenting, we were working with the Kodiak Science Center to develop a HACCP plan, at least to request the variance from DEC to allow us to make the traditional sea oil, to heat it for the specific times at the specific temperatures, and then to have a whole process of how we keep it all safe throughout the entire process, from making it to then freeze storing it in the jars there. And you can see Cyrus there pouring in the sea oil, and then the sea oil label jars there. So we got that 9-step process with Kodiak's help. And at this point now, we're basically at the point of completing the HACCP, and now we just got to submit it to DEC for variance to try to get them to sign off on it so we can start making sea oil for the long-term care. And to that end, Manila purchased this pasteurization equipment. I don't know if Chris wants to talk about this pasteurization equipment a little bit.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so we worked with Kodiak Seafood and Marine Science Center as our process authority to help inform, what decisions we would make for our HACCP plan, what equipment we would need to do the heat trials. As Alex mentioned earlier, we started out with trying to heat with a wok, but what we needed and what our process authority recommended was to use, tried and true heating equipment that can stir the sea oil uniformly, make sure heat is uniform, so that we can achieve that 176 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes and keep it at that temperature throughout that process so that we can have confidence that we've destroyed any toxin in there. So yeah, what you see here is equipment from Micro Dairy Designs. It's usually used for pasteurizing milk. So we're using it for a little different application here, but we've been getting familiar with it, running trials and heating up water in preparation for our first test batch of seal oil. We want to have it all down before we use it. But that's where we're at. We had this equipment set up right now over in the Siglok. We were supposed to do some heating yesterday on some oil, but we had a pretty big winter storm here. So we'll probably pick up today and heat some water, chart it out on that chart recorder you see there, and get familiar with that process. Cyrus has already got a natric seal, a ring seal, that's been rendering out according to our HACCP in the Siglok, so in a controlled environment. So we've got 3 gallons of sea oil that's practically ready now to be heat treated once we're familiar with this equipment. And again, our demonstration of heating the sea oil following our HACCP is all, we need to document that and provide that to Kodiak, which will ultimately go to the state for our waiver to produce safe sea oil. So that's where we're at. We're real close. We have the equipment. We're using it, and pretty soon I feel like we'll have everything done to start serving safe sea oil for the elders there in long-term care at any time they want it, which is exactly how we want long-term care to be. So I think that's the last slide of our presentation. And if there are any questions, I suppose we can all 3 answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. That sounds amazing. If anyone would like to write their question in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself. I see one from Jennifer. Would other long-term care facilities be able to use this process too for serving seal oil?
Yes, we'll be able to share that information once we successfully succeed.
Yes. So Cyrus was just talking to me here. We're in the same room here, but so we're demonstrating that it can be done. We're buying the sophisticated equipment, and we're doing all these things to make sure that it's safe, kept safe, and served safe. But we're happy to share that with any other institution that would want to do this. So yeah, we would share this information. The process would have to be the same or similar or more tightly controlled, I guess, if another institution wanted to do it their way. But the point is that we're demonstrating it can be done. Here's one safe way of making it. And, if other institutions can follow that, then they could have safe sea oil too. But I guess the one thing, like we had to learn a lot to do this. We were going to use a wok to heat treat and stir it, as our heat treatment step. But now we invested in this expensive, pasteurization equipment. So just to reiterate that it needs to be done right. And we use our process authority to help us figure this out. So yeah, it can be done. And we're showing one way to do it. And there might be other ways of creating safe sea oil too. Thanks.
Wonderful. Wow, lots of hoops to jump through for sure. Just wanted to say a quick chat earlier. Megan posted a link to a demographics survey as well as our silent auction. So do check those out. And I think we have one more minute if anybody else has one more question. Well, with that, I want to thank you all, Chris, Alex, and enjoy your lunch. We'll start back up right about, I think in half an hour, so 12:15
Thank
or so.
you.
Hey, if I can, this is Chris. If I can, I just want to thank Alex and Cyrus and a lot of the same, Brian Himmelblum, Chris Zanito, a lot of the folks that are part of this conference have really been part of, our effort here and really to get to where we've gotten. It's required a lot of people and a lot of expertise, and we're really appreciative of all that.
Dr. Johnson.
And Dr. Eric Johnson with University of Wisconsin. There's a long laundry list of people that have been part of this, and we're just so grateful for all their help and support while we do this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks.